The billionaire erased his ex-wife from his will. The mistress celebrated too soon. What neither of them realized was that Alexander Vale had built a trap inside his own estate. And 30 days after his funeral,
Alexander
that
was a
trap would turn a
decisive
social
man. He
queen
made his
into a
wishes
public
very
exile.
clear.
The cathedral
There
on
have
Fifth
been
Avenue stood
amendments you are
draped in
not
black
named
silk
in
and
the
quiet
primary
power,
will.
its marble steps crowded with dark SUVs and men who controlled markets with a phone call. Senators, venture capital magnates, media executives, and philanthropic
Alexander
royalty
believed in
gathered
fresh
beneath
vision.
vaulted ceilings to mourn Alexander Vale, the self-made billionaire whose tech empire reshaped half the country's infrastructure. The air smelled of incense and old money. Grief was present, but so was calculation. In rooms like this, death was never just personal. It was strategic. Evelyn Vale entered without spectacle. No cameras followed her, though many eyes did. She wore a sharply tailored black dress, no jewelry except a slim platinum watch Alexander had given her 25 years ago when their first merger closed. Her posture was straight, her expression composed, but her gaze missed nothing. She had once stood beside Alexander as co-architect of Vale Dynamics, negotiating with investors who now bowed their heads in choreographed sorrow. Some of them could not meet her eyes. Minutes later, a low murmur rippled through the cathedral as Camille Rourke stepped onto the aisle. She arrived wrapped in designer grief, dark glasses shielding a carefully composed face. Photographers leaned forward despite the solemn setting. For the past 3 years, Camille had been publicly recognized as Alexander's partner, his constant companion at galas and summits. Where Evelyn moved like foundation stone, Camille moved like fire, visible, attention-commanding, unapologetic. The seating arrangement said everything without saying a word. Evelyn was placed in the front pew among family, though legally she had not been family for years. Camille was seated across the aisle, close enough to be seen, far enough to signal hierarchy. The board members sat behind them, whispering in tones meant to resemble sympathy. "He left everything to her," someone murmured behind a gloved hand. "Or so I've heard," another replied. At the altar, the priest spoke of innovation, resilience, and vision. A tribute video played across mounted screens, Alexander in boardrooms, Alexander at charity events, Alexander smiling beside Camille. There were no images of Evelyn in those closing years. The omission was deliberate. The narrative had already been rewritten. From the back, Graham Whitmore watched both women carefully. As Alexander's longtime estate attorney, he understood more than anyone that funerals were openings, not endings. His expression remained neutral, but tension sat in his shoulders like concealed weight. After the final hymn, guests filtered into the courtyard where reporters waited beyond wrought iron gates. Camille removed her glasses and stepped into the sunlight with controlled vulnerability. Alexander was a decisive man, she said smoothly to the microphones. He made his wishes very clear. The statement landed with quiet authority. Evelyn did not approach the press. Instead, Graham touched her elbow lightly. "Mrs. Vale, Evelyn, may I have a moment?" They stepped into a private antechamber lined with oil portraits of donors long forgotten. The door closed softly behind them. For the first time that morning, the performance dropped. "There have been amendments," Graham began, choosing each word with surgical care. "Recent amendments." Evelyn's face did not change. "Go on." "You are not named in the primary will." The words hung between them, heavy but not entirely unexpected. She inhaled once, slow and controlled. "Not even in advisory capacity?" "No." Silence expanded. In that silence, Evelyn's mind moved swiftly through years of board meetings, asset structures, tax shields, trust formations. Alexander had never made impulsive financial decisions. If she was erased, it was either intentional or strategic beyond the obvious. "Camille?" Evelyn asked. "She is a beneficiary," Graham confirmed, though under structured conditions. A faint shift passed through Evelyn's eyes, not pain, not shock, but calculation. "And the foundation?" "Receives the majority." Outside, Camille's voice rose faintly as she reassured a journalist. Alexander believed in fresh vision. Fresh vision. Evelyn almost smiled at the irony. She had once told Alexander that legacy was not built on attention but architecture. He had listened then. Graham lowered his voice. There is something else. A sealed amendment filed separately. It cannot be opened for 30 days. Evelyn finally looked directly at him. Why 30? Alexander's instruction. In the courtyard, Camille posed for one final photograph before stepping into a waiting car, confident the future had already been secured. Inside the cathedral, beneath the echo of fading footsteps, Graham added quietly, whatever this amendment contains, it may change everything. And for the first time that morning, uncertainty entered the room. Long before the cathedral filled with polished grief, there had been a cramped apartment in Brooklyn where ambition lived louder than comfort. Alexander Vale had possessed vision, but it was Evelyn who gave that vision structure. In the early years of their marriage, when venture capitalists dismissed Alexander as another reckless dreamer, Evelyn sat at the dining table past midnight building financial models that made those same investors lean forward and listen. She understood risk the way surgeons understand arteries, precisely, without panic. Their partnership had once been electric. Alexander would pace the room, outlining grand expansions, while Evelyn dissected each idea into measurable, executable steps. Dream bigger, he would insist. She would respond calmly, I'm just making sure it survives. It was Evelyn who negotiated their first institutional investment, strategically surrendering less equity than anyone thought possible. It was Evelyn who identified the small cybersecurity startup that later became Vale Dynamics' most profitable acquisition. At 32, she orchestrated their first major merger across state lines, sitting across from seasoned executives who underestimated her composure. By the end of that meeting, they were the ones conceding. As the company scaled, so did Alexander's appetite for recognition. Media profiles began featuring him alone. Headlines crowned him the visionary disruptor. Photographs cropped Evelyn out of the frame. At first, she dismissed it as branding necessity. Alexander thrived under spotlight, she thrived in control rooms. But slowly, subtle shifts occurred. Interviews were scheduled without her knowledge. Strategic decisions were announced before she reviewed them. Praise inflated him in ways she could not regulate. I built this too, she told him one night after a televised awards ceremony where he failed to mention her once. You know that, he replied, loosening his tie. But perception matters. Perception, she said evenly, eventually becomes truth. The distance between them widened not with shouting, but with silence. Then came the gala. The charity event glittered with donors and senators. That was the first night Camille Rourke appeared on Alexander's arm. She was radiant, articulate, effortlessly attuned to the room. Evelyn noticed how Camille laughed at exactly the right moments, how she leaned into Alexander's narratives about innovation and legacy. Camille asked questions that flattered ego rather than challenged logic. It was subtle, but Evelyn recognized strategy when she saw it. Over the following months, Alexander's schedule changed. Dinners ran later. Travel became more frequent. When confronted, he did not deny the emotional shift. I need something different, he admitted, not angrily but with exhausted honesty. The divorce that followed was controlled, almost surgical. Evelyn did not beg or retaliate. She negotiated. She ensured her settlement reflected her early equity stake and intellectual contribution. She declined public statements. The press called it amicable. In reality, it was a Cold War disguised as civility. Yet something unsettled her during those negotiations. Financial disclosures revealed asset transfers she had not authorized. Certain holdings had been quietly repositioned into private entities months before the divorce filing. When she asked Alexander about it, he responded with casual dismissal. Just estate planning, he said. Nothing personal. Nothing personal. Evelyn hired independent analysts, not to contest the settlement, but to understand the architecture forming behind it. Patterns emerged. Shell structures layered beneath legitimate subsidiaries. Timing aligned suspiciously with Camille's increasing presence in corporate spaces. One evening, weeks before the divorce was finalized, Evelyn accessed public registry filings out of habit more than suspicion. A newly formed discretionary trust caught her attention. It had been established under Alexander's authority, funded with substantial non-public shares, and shielded under complex compliance provisions. She scanned the document twice, then a third time, her pulse steady but colder than before. Her name was nowhere within it. Not as beneficiary. Not as advisor. Not even as contingency. This was not emotional restructuring. It was strategic removal. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, the city skyline flickering beyond her window. She understood now that Alexander had not simply moved on, he had begun rewriting history while she was still inside it. And if he had engineered this trust months before the divorce, then Camille had not just entered the picture, she had influenced the blueprint. The realization settled with chilling clarity: she had built the empire, but someone else was quietly redesigning its future without her. And she intended to find out exactly how deep that redesign went. Camille Rourke had never believed in accidents when it came to power. Before Alexander Vale, she had built a career in high-level image management, reshaping reputations for CEOs whose scandals threatened to fracture billion-dollar valuations. She understood the mechanics of perception, how public sympathy could be engineered, and how legacy was often more fragile than wealth. When she first encountered Alexander at that charity gala, she did not see merely a powerful man. She saw a man terrified of irrelevance. Alexander was aging, though he hid it behind relentless expansion and media appearances. He spoke often about future-proofing the company and ensuring his name endured beyond quarterly earnings. Camille listened more than she spoke in those early weeks. She asked precise questions, never confrontational, always affirming. "How do you want history to remember you?" she asked one evening over dinner overlooking the Hudson. The question lingered longer than any compliment could. She studied him methodically. His pride in innovation. His resentment toward early critics. His complicated respect for Evelyn. That last element interested her most. Alexander rarely criticized his former wife directly, but he spoke of her with cautious acknowledgement. She was always 3 moves ahead, he once admitted. Camille filed that away. A strategist recognizes another strategist. Slowly, she positioned herself not as distraction, but as reinforcement. "You built this," she would say, subtly reinforcing the narrative media had already embraced. "Your vision changed industries." When he mentioned estate planning, she leaned in carefully. "You can't leave room for confusion," she advised. "Legacy should be decisive." It was not overt manipulation, it was suggestion layered inside affirmation. The first revision to the will occurred quietly. Camille did not draft it herself, but she encouraged clarity. "If Evelyn still has advisory influence," she asked one night, "won't that blur your final authority?" Alexander frowned at that. Authority mattered deeply to him. Within weeks, amendments were filed reducing Evelyn's indirect influence within certain holding structures. Camille never demanded, she framed everything as protection. She also understood isolation as a tactic. Alexander's older advisors, men who remembered Evelyn's strategic brilliance, remained cautious around Camille. She noticed the tension and worked subtly to erode it. "They don't see the future," she would whisper after meetings. "They're loyal to a version of you that doesn't exist anymore." Gradually, invitations to private strategy sessions shifted. Trusted executives found themselves excluded. Camille became present in conversations she once would have been barred from entirely. Meanwhile, Alexander's health began showing signs of quiet strain. Nothing dramatic, nothing publicly alarming. But fatigue lingered longer. Headaches became frequent. Doctors reassured him that stress was the primary factor. Camille responded with visible concern, positioning herself as caretaker. "You need to simplify," she insisted gently. "Streamline everything. Remove complications." Estate lawyers were summoned again. Graham Whitmore maintained professional composure, but he noted the increasing pace of modifications. Trust structures tightened. Moral clauses were inserted into beneficiary provisions, behavioral conditions tied to public reputation and conduct. Camille skimmed documents during signing sessions, trusting that her presence equaled control. She declined independent legal counsel, believing proximity to Alexander was sufficient leverage. One afternoon, in the private study of Alexander's penthouse, a supplemental estate clause was presented for signature. It referenced compliance standards, discretionary oversight, and automatic revocation triggers under certain defined circumstances. Camille glanced at the summary page and smiled faintly. "This protects everything," she said confidently. Alexander looked at her for a long moment before signing. There was something unreadable in his expression, fatigue, perhaps, or calculation. "It protects the future," he replied. Camille signed as witness without reading the final page in full. She did not request clarification. She assumed alignment. After all, she believed she had secured the throne. What she failed to notice was that the final page redefined the throne entirely. The executive boardroom of Vail Dynamics did not resemble a place of mourning. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan's financial district, and the long obsidian table reflected the skyline like a polished blade. This was where acquisitions were decided, competitors dismantled, and fortunes recalibrated. It was fitting, in a cold and deliberate way, that Alexander Vail's final wishes would be revealed here rather than in a courtroom. Power deserved a familiar setting. Evelyn arrived first. She chose a seat midway down the table, neither claiming dominance nor accepting exile. Her posture was composed, a leather folder resting neatly before her. Across the room, board members whispered in restrained tones. They had all benefited from Alexander's ambition, now they were calculating survival without him. Camille entered minutes later in a cream-tailored suit that signaled both mourning and confidence. Her chin was lifted slightly higher than usual. She did not glance at Evelyn, though she was acutely aware of her presence. Instead, she positioned herself at the head of the table, Alexander's seat. It was subtle, but intentional. Graham Whitmore cleared his throat once the doors closed. His voice carried the steady neutrality of a man accustomed to volatile rooms. "Thank you for attending. As executor of Alexander Vail's estate, I will now proceed with the formal reading of his last will and testament." The air shifted. He began with standard formalities before moving to the substance. The majority of Alexander Vail's controlling shares, private equity interests, and liquid assets are hereby transferred to the Vail Humanitarian Foundation. A murmur rippled across the table. The foundation had been significant, yes, but majority control was unexpected. Several board members exchanged quick glances. Camille's fingers tightened around the armrest of Alexander's chair. This was not how she had imagined it unfolding. Graham continued calmly. "The foundation is structured under an independent governance model, with oversight provisions designed to protect its public mission." "Independent?" Camille interrupted, her voice measured but edged. "Independent from whom?" "From any single beneficiary," Graham replied evenly. He proceeded. "Ms. Camille Rourke is named as beneficiary of a structured discretionary trust. This trust provides for annual disbursements subject to compliance with the conditions outlined herein." "Conditions?" Camille repeated, leaning forward. Evelyn remained silent, watching. Graham adjusted his glasses. "The trust includes behavioral and reputational clauses. Any actions that materially damage the public integrity of the Vail name or the Foundation's mission may result in suspension or revocation of benefits." The room quieted completely. "That's standard," Camille said quickly, though her tone betrayed irritation. Reputation clauses are common. Yes, Graham agreed, but these provisions include discretionary review by a compliance committee. And who sits on that committee? Camille asked. Graham did not look at her immediately. Members of the board and designated external advisors. Camille's gaze flickered briefly toward Evelyn, then away. And Mrs. Vale? A board member asked cautiously. Graham turned a page. Evelyn Vale is not named as a direct financial beneficiary. Silence settled with sharp clarity. Camille exhaled slowly, satisfaction breaking through her restraint. For the first time that morning, a faint smile touched her lips. She did not look at Evelyn, but she did not need to. Evelyn's expression did not change. No flinch. No visible reaction. Only the slightest narrowing of her eyes, as though processing variables in a complex equation. Graham continued. However, Mrs. Vale's prior settlement agreements remain intact and legally binding. A few board members shifted uneasily. They understood the implication. Evelyn had already secured her portion years ago. Camille leaned back, reclaiming composure. So that's it? She asked lightly. Alexander ensured the foundation thrives, and I am entrusted with carrying forward his personal vision. Graham paused before responding. There is an additional matter. Every head lifted. A sealed codicil was filed separately under Alexander's direct instruction. It is not to be opened until 30 days after the date of his passing. The tension sharpened instantly. What does it contain? Camille demanded. I am not authorized to disclose its contents until the designated date, Graham replied. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice calm and level. Is the codicil conditional? Graham hesitated just long enough for the room to notice. Yes. Conditional on what? Camille pressed. Graham closed the folder gently. The codicil contains contingencies triggered by misconduct or material breach of the estate's integrity provisions. The words hung in the air like a drawn blade. Camille's composure faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. Misconduct by whom? She asked quietly. Any beneficiary, Graham said. Outside the boardroom windows, traffic flowed unaware of the power struggle unfolding above it. Inside, alliances recalibrated in real time. The foundation controlled the empire. The trust came with invisible tripwires. And somewhere within a sealed document lay conditions none of them fully understood. Camille's confidence did not vanish, but it cracked. Evelyn gathered her folder without a word, rising smoothly from her seat. She did not look victorious. She looked patient. As the meeting adjourned, Graham remained seated for a moment longer, aware that the real conflict had only begun. The codicil was not symbolic. It was specific. And if triggered, it would not wound gently. Evelyn did not attend charity dinners or issue carefully worded statements after the will reading. She did not defend herself in interviews, nor did she correct the subtle shift in media narrative that now framed Camille as the emotional center of Alexander's final years. Instead, she scheduled a private meeting in a discreet midtown office tower where reputations were dismantled more quietly than they were built. That was where Daniel Cross worked. Daniel was not flashy, nor did he cultivate celebrity clientele for publicity. He specialized in estate litigation where billions were hidden behind layers of compliance language and conditional trusts. When Evelyn entered his office, he did not waste time on condolences. He closed the blinds, placed a legal pad on the table, and asked a single question. What feels wrong? Evelyn did not hesitate. The timing. Within 48 hours, Daniel's team reconstructed the amendment timeline of Alexander's estate documents. The pattern was subtle but troubling. Multiple revisions had occurred over the final 6 months, increasing in frequency as Alexander's public appearances decreased. The most critical amendment, the one significantly tightening trust conditions and solidifying the foundation's majority control, had been executed 48 hours before his death. Daniel circled that date twice. Was he hospitalized at that time? Fatigued, Evelyn replied evenly. But cognitively sharp. Fatigue can be leveraged, Daniel said. Forensic accountants were brought in under confidentiality agreements. They traced asset migrations that had been shielded through layered LLC structures. Certain transfers aligned precisely with Camille's increased presence at executive meetings. The financial trail did not prove coercion, but it suggested influence. Meanwhile, Camille moved aggressively in the public arena. She appeared on a televised business program speaking about Alexander's forward-looking generosity. She described herself as committed to preserving his legacy and dismissed rumors of internal dispute as grief-fueled speculation. The performance was poised, almost flawless. Daniel watched the interview without expression. She's framing herself as continuity, he observed. That's intentional. Evelyn folded her hands. Continuity requires control. 3 days later, Daniel's team uncovered something unexpected within Veil Dynamics' internal data systems. Alexander had maintained a private encrypted server partition accessible only through biometric authorization. It was not referenced in any public corporate documentation. Access required a court order, which Daniel pursued carefully, framing the request as due diligence in light of contested amendments. While waiting for judicial approval, Daniel reviewed security logs from Alexander's penthouse. Entry timestamps showed multiple late-night visits by Camille during the weeks leading to the final estate revision. No staff present. No executive advisors. Just the two of them behind closed doors. Influence isn't illegal, Daniel said during their next meeting. Undue influence is. Evelyn's voice remained calm. He respected strength. He distrusted desperation. And which was she? Daniel asked. That depends on what she wanted most. The court granted limited access to the encrypted server under protective order. Daniel's technical consultant worked overnight decrypting archived files. What emerged was not a single document but a structured digital vault, organized, categorized, intentionally hidden. Inside were recorded voice memos, timestamped strategy notes, and private video files. Alexander had documented conversations, not for publicity, but for preservation. Some entries reflected doubt. Others captured strategic reflections about loyalty and succession. Daniel scrolled further until a single folder caught his attention. It was titled in plain text, almost understated. If I was wrong. He paused before opening it. In the city above, Camille finalized another press release reaffirming her commitment to the Foundation's mission. She had no knowledge that beneath the surface of public narrative, a different record was being assembled, one she had never anticipated. Daniel leaned back slowly, eyes fixed on the screen. This, he said quietly, is not routine documentation. Evelyn did not ask what was inside yet. She only studied Daniel's face, measuring the shift in his composure. Open it, she said. Daniel clicked on the folder. And the first video file began to load. Camille Rourke had always believed that perception was leverage. As long as the image held, the power would follow. That belief guided her the morning she instructed her financial advisor to initiate the first major withdrawal from her structured trust. The amount was significant but justified, she argued, as part of her transition into a more public leadership role within the Veil Humanitarian Foundation. She expected compliance, perhaps minor paperwork. What she did not expect was hesitation. There's a hold, her advisor said carefully over speakerphone. A hold? Camille repeated, her voice tightening. On what grounds? The trust requires compliance confirmation before discretionary disbursements of that scale. Camille's jaw stiffened. Compliance with what? With the moral and reputational clause embedded in the estate. For the first time since the will reading, a flicker of unease crossed her face. She ended the call abruptly and contacted Graham Whitmore directly. He agreed to meet her at his office that afternoon. In the hours before that meeting, the social temperature shifted. An invitation to a high-profile Manhattan benefit dinner was quietly rescinded. A luxury fashion house postponed a campaign announcement tied to her public image. A financial blog published a speculative piece questioning the timing of Alexander's final estate amendments. It stopped short of accusation, but the tone had changed. When Camille entered Graham's office, she did not sit. "What exactly is happening?" she demanded. Graham folded his hands. "A routine compliance review." "Routine?" Her voice sharpened. "My trust is being restricted based on rumors." "It's not rumors," he replied evenly. "The Foundation's governance model requires review if public scrutiny risks damaging its mission." "So now scrutiny equals guilt?" "No," Graham said calmly. "It equals caution." Camille stepped closer to his desk. "You assured me the structure was secure." "It is secure," he answered, "provided its conditions are met." Her composure fractured slightly. "I stood by Alexander when no one else did." "That may be," Graham replied, "but the clauses were written by Alexander himself." That fact unsettled her more than anything else. By evening, the board of the Foundation had convened an internal review panel. The language was procedural, detached, corporate. Behavioral assessment. Reputational risk analysis. Camille read the notice twice, disbelief hardening into anger. She called one of the board members directly. "This is absurd," she insisted. "You're reacting to media noise." "We're reacting to fiduciary responsibility," the board member responded. "The Foundation controls the majority of Vail assets now. Stability is non-negotiable." "And I'm unstable?" she asked coldly. "No one said that," came the careful reply. "But perception is volatile." The irony did not escape her. She had once weaponized perception. Now it was being used against her. Meanwhile, another article surfaced questioning whether Alexander's late-stage amendments had been influenced by external pressure. The piece referenced anonymous sources within the legal community. Camille recognized the shift immediately. This was not random speculation. Someone was guiding the narrative carefully, strategically. That night, as she sat alone in the penthouse that still bore Alexander's presence in subtle details, her phone buzzed with a formal notification from the Trust's administrative office. She opened the encrypted email slowly, expecting clarification. Instead, she read the words twice before they fully registered. "Trust disbursements suspended pending investigation." The message was concise, impersonal, final. Camille lowered the phone, her reflection staring back at her in the darkened glass. For the first time since Alexander's death, control was no longer in her hands. And somewhere behind the silence, someone was watching her next move. The court authorization came through on a gray Thursday morning, understated and procedural, but its implications were anything but routine. Daniel Cross did not celebrate. He simply forwarded the approval to his forensic analyst and instructed him to begin extraction under sealed conditions. Evelyn sat across from him in the conference room, hands folded, her expression calm but sharpened with anticipation. Whatever existed inside Alexander's encrypted archive was not sentimental preservation. It was strategic. The digital vault required biometric override layered with a judicial passkey. Once decrypted, the interface revealed meticulously categorized files, audio logs, video recordings, personal memos, time-stamped notes. Alexander had documented more than business strategy, he had documented doubt. Daniel opened the earliest file within the folder labeled Private Reflections. Alexander appeared on screen seated in his study, city lights behind him. He looked tired but alert, speaking directly toward the camera as though addressing an unseen audience. "Clarity matters," he said in a low, deliberate voice. "If decisions are questioned later, context will matter more." Evelyn did not flinch at the sound of his voice. She listened analytically. Several recordings followed, conversations between Alexander and Camille, captured either intentionally or through integrated home security systems. In one clip, Camille's tone was measured but persistent. "You cannot leave loose ends," she insisted. "Evelyn still has indirect influence. That weakens your final authority." Alexander's reply was restrained. "She understands the structure better than anyone." "That's exactly why," Camille responded. "If she stays adjacent, your legacy won't feel decisive." The pressure was subtle, framed as advice rather than demand. Yet repetition carried weight. Over multiple recordings, Camille returned to the same theme: removal, consolidation, clarity through exclusion. In another video, recorded weeks later, Alexander appeared alone again. "There is a difference," he said thoughtfully, "between loyalty and control." He paused as though weighing something internal. "And sometimes the person urging control doesn't see the long game." Daniel exchanged a brief glance with Evelyn. "He was aware," he murmured. Medical reports embedded in the archive supported that awareness. Cognitive assessments conducted within the final month of his life confirmed fatigue but no impairment. There was no documented dementia, no confusion, no compromised executive function. The legal threshold for incapacity was nowhere close to being met. That complicated everything. A particularly revealing clip showed Camille seated across from Alexander at the penthouse dining table. The tone was no longer advisory, it was sharper. "If you don't fully remove her," Camille said, voice tight with restrained frustration, "she will always be in the background. People still see her as the architect. That undermines you." Alexander leaned back, studying her. "She was the architect," he replied evenly. "That was then," Camille shot back. "This is your final chapter." Silence stretched between them before the recording ended abruptly. Daniel leaned forward, fingers steepled. "This demonstrates influence," he said carefully. "But not coercion in the legal sense." Evelyn nodded slowly. "He made his own decisions." "Yes," Daniel agreed. "But he anticipated dispute." Another file contained a voice memo recorded only days before the final estate amendment. Alexander sounded contemplative, almost wary. "If pressure becomes confusion," he stated quietly, "I need proof that it was pressure, not incapacity." That distinction was critical. The recordings did not portray a manipulated invalid. They portrayed a powerful man navigating competing influences, documenting the environment around him as insurance. Strategic ambiguity remained intact. There was no smoking gun, no overt threat, no signature forced under duress. Yet the pattern was undeniable: repeated urging from Camille to isolate Evelyn completely, to consolidate symbolic authority, to erase residual influence. Daniel exhaled slowly. "This is powerful, but it must be deployed precisely. If we move too aggressively, we risk appearing vindictive." Evelyn's gaze remained fixed on the screen. "I'm not interested in vengeance," she said quietly. "I'm interested in accuracy." Daniel scrolled further through the folder until he noticed a final file separated from the rest. Its timestamp stood out immediately. 3 hours before Alexander's death. The file name was simple. No commentary. No label beyond date and time. Daniel hesitated, cursor hovering over it. Evelyn's voice was steady but softer than before. "Open it." The screen darkened as the file began to load, revealing the final recorded moment Alexander chose to preserve. And whatever he had said in those last hours had the potential to redefine everything. The final video from the vault did not explode like a bomb. It landed like a blueprint. Alexander appeared weaker than in previous recordings, his voice quieter but unmistakably steady. "If influence crosses into coercion," he said directly into the camera, "then the structure must protect itself." He did not name Camille. He did not accuse anyone. But he outlined something far more significant than suspicion. He described a mechanism. The foundation, he continued, is the firewall. No individual controls it. Not even the person closest to me. When the screen went dark, silence lingered in Daniel Cross's office. Evelyn did not react emotionally. She processed. Structure. Firewall. Protection. Alexander had not been surrendering control, he had been redistributing it. Within 48 hours, Daniel secured a formal review of the Vail Humanitarian Foundation's bylaws. The documents were dense, layered with compliance language and cross-referenced provisions. What initially appeared philanthropic was, in reality, architectural defense. The foundation held majority ownership of Alexander's voting shares, but its governance was intentionally fragmented to prevent domination by any one beneficiary. Daniel traced the clauses carefully. Then he found it. If evidence of material coercion, reputational sabotage, or undue influence is substantiated through verified documentation, the provision stated, all discretionary trusts linked to the affected beneficiary shall be automatically voided. Camille's trust. Daniel leaned back slowly. He anticipated this scenario, he murmured. Evelyn's voice was level. He anticipated conflict. But the next clause was even more precise. In the event of a trust void triggered by coercion findings, advisory authority over the Foundation's strategic direction would transfer temporarily to a designated silent partner, identified only within a sealed appendix. The appendix required executor authorization to reveal. Graham Whitmore did not look pleased when Daniel presented the legal motion requesting its disclosure, supported by excerpts from the digital vault. "You're escalating this," Graham said carefully. "No," Daniel replied. "We're activating what your client designed." Under sealed review, the appendix was opened. The silent partner was Evelyn Vail. Not a beneficiary. Not a trustee. But a contingency advisor granted interim strategic oversight if integrity clauses were triggered. For the first time since Alexander's death, the power balance tilted perceptibly. News began shifting as well. A financial investigative journalist published a measured article referencing newly surfaced documentation suggesting strategic estate safeguards. The tone was no longer sympathetic toward Camille. It was cautious. Analytical. Questions replaced assumptions. Camille responded swiftly with a statement condemning misinterpretation of private grief. Yet the certainty in her voice began to thin. Daniel filed a narrowly tailored injunction, introducing selected excerpts from the recordings, just enough to establish repeated pressure regarding Evelyn's removal, without appearing vindictive. The argument was precise, not incapacity, not fraud, but influence inconsistent with fiduciary integrity. The Foundation board convened an emergency session. Inside the same boardroom where the will had been read, tension felt sharper this time. Camille arrived determined, though the controlled confidence she once radiated had dimmed. She faced a semicircle of directors no longer deferential. "This is procedural paranoia," she argued, voice firm. "Alexander trusted me." "He also trusted governance," one board member replied. "You're reacting to selective leaks," Camille pressed. "Where is the evidence of misconduct?" Daniel placed a folder on the table. "The evidence demonstrates persistent efforts to eliminate independent oversight. That meets the threshold for review." Camille's eyes flickered briefly toward Evelyn, who sat composed but silent. That silence unsettled her more than accusation would have. "This is revenge," Camille said suddenly, the word cutting through the room. Evelyn spoke for the first time. "If it were revenge, you would already be removed." The room stilled. The board chair cleared his throat. "Under Section 9.4 of the bylaws, we are obligated to vote on provisional suspension pending full investigation." Camille's composure fractured for a fraction of a second. "You can't seriously consider removing me based on speculation." "It is not removal," the chair corrected carefully. It is a compliance safeguard. But everyone understood the implication. Outside the building, cameras had already gathered, sensing the shift in narrative. Inside, directors exchanged measured glances, aware that whatever decision they made would reshape not only Camille's future but the foundation's public legitimacy. The vote was scheduled for the following morning. As Camille exited the boardroom, her steps were controlled but hurried. She reached for her phone, dialing her attorney with urgency she could no longer conceal. Inside, the board members remained seated, files open before them, weighing evidence against optics, loyalty against stability. And for the first time since Alexander's death, Camille was no longer standing on solid ground. By sunrise, the board would decide whether she remained part of the Vale legacy or became the first casualty of its defense. In Manhattan's financial circles, loyalty was never emotional, it was transactional. The first fracture appeared in the form of a headline published by a respected financial journal questioning the compressed timeline of Alexander Vale's final estate amendments. The article was careful, legally precise, but the implication was sharp. Why were multiple revisions executed within weeks of his death, and who stood to benefit most? It did not accuse Camille Rourke outright, but it did something more dangerous: it invited scrutiny. Within hours, analysts debated the story on business networks. Commentators avoided direct claims of misconduct, yet phrases like undue proximity and estate influence dynamics circulated freely. Camille watched the segment from her penthouse, her jaw tightening as her name trended alongside words she had spent a career erasing for others. Then came the corporate distancing. A luxury fashion house that had recently positioned Camille as the elegant face of modern philanthropy issued a quiet press statement: collaboration paused pending internal review. The wording was diplomatic, but the message was unmistakable. Their brand would not risk alignment with instability. A prestigious children's charity followed by removing her from its advisory board, citing organizational restructuring. The euphemism fooled no one. Invitations once extended months in advance began to disappear without explanation. Dinners postponed. Panels reassigned. Calls returned by assistants instead of principals. Camille's public relations firm requested an emergency meeting. 3 senior partners arrived with carefully neutral expressions. "The environment is volatile," one of them explained. "We recommend reducing exposure until the compliance review concludes." "Reducing exposure?" Camille repeated sharply. "I am the story. Silence makes me look guilty." "Silence," the partner replied carefully, "prevents escalation." 2 days later, the firm terminated its contract, citing irreconcilable strategic differences. The message was delivered by email. Social isolation intensified with ruthless efficiency. Friends who once sought her presence now offered vague apologies about scheduling conflicts. A private club she frequented informed her that her membership privileges were under review. Even casual acquaintances adopted polite distance, conversations cooling mid-sentence when she entered a room. Meanwhile, Evelyn Vale did nothing publicly. She did not comment on articles. She did not appear on panels. She attended foundation meetings quietly, offering structural suggestions rather than emotional statements. Her silence created contrast. In comparison, Camille's attempts at defense appeared reactive. Daniel Cross understood timing better than spectacle. He authorized the release of narrowly selected excerpts from the digital vault, nothing inflammatory, nothing theatrical. Just enough to demonstrate repeated conversations where Camille urged Alexander to eliminate Evelyn's remaining influence. The evidence was framed not as accusation but as context. The impact was immediate. Commentators shifted tone from curiosity to analysis. "Pattern of influence," one legal analyst remarked. "Not illegal on its face, but ethically complex." The word complex lingered, inviting viewers to draw their own conclusions. Camille confronted Daniel's move through her attorney, accusing him of narrative manipulation. "This is character assassination," she argued during a tense conference call. Daniel's voice remained composed. "We have released factual recordings. No interpretation. You're destroying his memory, she shot back. No, Daniel replied evenly. We're protecting the structure he built. That answer infuriated her. As scrutiny intensified, Camille's financial advisors warned that extended suspension of trust disbursement would strain liquidity. Assets were technically hers, but inaccessible pending review. The illusion of control she once projected began to crack under visible pressure. One evening, after another event cancellation, Camille stood alone in the dimly lit penthouse overlooking the river. The city glittered indifferently below. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had avoided until now. When the call connected, her voice was steady but edged with something colder than fear. If they want a fight, she said quietly, I can give them one. On the other end, her attorney hesitated. What are you proposing? Camille stared at the skyline, calculating risk against desperation. Alexander wasn't perfect, she replied. And there are things the Foundation would prefer remain private. Silence stretched. Are you threatening to expose him? The attorney asked carefully. Camille's expression hardened. I'm reminding them that legacy cuts both ways. And for the first time since her fall began, she stopped defending herself and started preparing to retaliate. Camille Rourke had never survived by retreating. When pressure mounted, she expanded. When doors narrowed, she forced them open. Within 72 hours of her public isolation intensifying, she filed a civil lawsuit in New York Supreme Court alleging targeted reputational sabotage, selective evidence release, and manipulative narrative framing designed to trigger the coercion clause in Alexander Vale's estate. The language was aggressive. The strategy was deliberate. If she could not control the boardroom, she would control the courtroom. The filing accused Daniel Cross of orchestrating a calculated campaign to weaponize grief and destabilize her standing within the Foundation. It implied that Evelyn Vale had coordinated the release of private recordings to engineer a hostile governance takeover. Camille framed herself not as aggressor, but as the victim of institutional retaliation. By the time the hearing date was scheduled, media outlets were already dissecting the complaint. Legal commentators debated whether the moral compliance clause was being applied fairly or exploited strategically. Camille appeared outside the courthouse in navy, composed, eyes steady as cameras flashed. This is about fairness, she told reporters. I will not be erased based on selective interpretation. Inside the courtroom, however, confidence met resistance. Daniel Cross stood with a stack of indexed binders, methodical and unflinching. Evelyn sat behind him, not seeking attention, observing every detail. The judge, a seasoned jurist known for intolerance toward theatrics, reviewed the filings before speaking. Ms. Rourke alleges coordinated manipulation of estate mechanisms, the judge began evenly. Mr. Cross, your response? Daniel stepped forward. Your Honor, we have introduced verified excerpts from private recordings maintained by the decedent himself. These were not manufactured, nor selectively edited beyond relevance. They demonstrate repeated pressure applied to restructure estate oversight in a manner that directly conflicts with fiduciary safeguards. Camille's attorney rose immediately. Influence is not coercion, he argued. Personal conversations are being mischaracterized to fit a predetermined narrative. The judge turned to Daniel. Are these recordings authenticated? Preliminarily, yes, Daniel replied. But we welcome full forensic review. Camille's gaze shifted briefly toward Evelyn, searching for reaction. Evelyn gave none. Daniel continued, carefully measured. We are not alleging incapacity. We are establishing context consistent with the triggering provisions written by Mr. Vale himself. The judge studied Camille for a long moment. Ms. Rourke, did you encourage the decedent to remove Ms. Vale from advisory influence? Camille's jaw tightened. I advised him to protect his legacy. That is not the question, the judge replied calmly. My conversations were private, she said. And mutual. The courtroom remained silent long enough for tension to settle visibly. Daniel requested permission to introduce a partial transcript from one of the recordings already disclosed publicly. The judge allowed it. The clerk read aloud Camille's own words urging Alexander to eliminate residual control permanently. The phrasing echoed sharply against the courtroom walls. Camille's attorney objected, calling it contextual distortion. The judge overruled, noting that full recordings would be reviewed under forensic supervision. By afternoon, the narrative outside the courthouse had shifted. Analysts now framed Camille's lawsuit as defensive escalation rather than righteous correction. Headlines began using language like risk exposure and estate trigger thresholds. The judge leaned forward slightly. Given the dispute over authenticity and context, this court orders comprehensive forensic voice authentication of all submitted recordings, including the final file timestamp 3 hours prior to Mr. Vale's death. The words hung heavy. Daniel did not react outwardly, but the significance was immediate. The final unopened recording, until now shielded under limited disclosure, would be subjected to full judicial examination. Camille felt the ground shift beneath her composure. Your Honor, her attorney began cautiously, we request restriction of that final file pending review. Denied, the judge replied. Transparency serves all parties. Outside, cameras captured Camille exiting with controlled determination, though the tightness around her eyes betrayed calculation. She had chosen aggression. Now she would have to endure exposure. Back in his office, Daniel closed the case file slowly. Evelyn stood beside the window overlooking Lower Manhattan, her voice quiet but precise. If that recording confirms what we suspect, she said, the clause activates. Daniel nodded. And if it reveals something else, everything changes. On the courthouse docket, the authentication order was filed formally. And within days, the final recording would either solidify Camille's collapse or ignite a far more dangerous war. The sealed codicil was opened under judicial supervision in a controlled conference room adjacent to the courthouse, away from cameras but heavy with consequence. Present were Daniel Cross, Camille's legal counsel, Graham Whitmore as executor, and 2 representatives from the Vale Humanitarian Foundation. Evelyn attended without visible anticipation. She did not sit at the head of the table, nor did she claim proximity to the document. She simply waited. Graham broke the seal carefully, unfolding the final pages Alexander Vale had instructed remain closed for 30 days. His voice remained steady as he began reading, but the language carried unmistakable precision. In the event that verified documentation establishes material coercion, reputational manipulation, or persistent influence inconsistent with fiduciary integrity, Graham read, any discretionary trust granted to the involved beneficiary shall be deemed automatically void without further litigation. Camille's attorney stiffened. Define verified documentation, he interrupted. Daniel answered calmly. Authenticated recordings qualify. As if on cue, the forensic report was placed on the table. The voice authentication had been completed. Spectrographic analysis, metadata verification, timestamp validation, every technical safeguard confirmed the recordings were unaltered and genuine. The final file, recorded 3 hours before Alexander's death, had been authenticated without anomaly. Graham continued reading. Upon automatic voidance of such trust, interim advisory authority over foundation strategy shall transfer to the designated silent partner named Hirin. He paused briefly before stating the name. Evelyn Vale. No one in the room reacted immediately. The shift was too decisive for theatrics. Camille's composure did not shatter, it tightened. He was pressured, she said quietly, though the words lacked earlier conviction. Those recordings are incomplete. Daniel's voice was measured but firm. The recordings demonstrate repeated urging to eliminate oversight entirely. The codicil addresses precisely that scenario. Graham resumed. All assets previously allocated under the voided trust are to be frozen pending compliance review and final administrative determination. The weight of it settled. Camille's discretionary trust, her financial security, her projected dominance, ceased to exist not by vote, but by automatic trigger. There was no negotiation clause. No discretionary override. The Foundation representatives exchanged brief glances. The mechanism had functioned exactly as designed. Evelyn finally spoke, not triumphantly, but with controlled clarity. Alexander built redundancies into everything. He anticipated conflict. Camille turned toward her sharply. You orchestrated this. No, Evelyn replied evenly. He did. The board convened that afternoon in emergency session. The forensic findings were presented alongside the codicil's provisions. Directors who had once hesitated now moved with decisive alignment. The Foundation's primary obligation, they affirmed, was institutional integrity. With the trust voided automatically, Camille's influence within the organization dissolved as a matter of procedure. By evening, internal notices were drafted. Asset access frozen. Voting privileges suspended. Public statement prepared. Outside, financial networks reported the development with careful astonishment. Strategic safeguard activates, one headline read. Another described it as a posthumous countermeasure. Camille exited the courthouse through a side corridor, her attorney speaking rapidly beside her. The composure she had maintained for weeks now carried strain. We can appeal procedural fairness, her attorney suggested. On what grounds? She asked quietly. Silence followed. Inside the Foundation headquarters, Evelyn stood alone for a moment in the executive conference room that had once belonged to Alexander. She did not sit in his chair. She placed her hand briefly on the backrest, then withdrew it. This was not revenge. It was structural correction. As night fell, another development surfaced quietly but with ominous undertones. Federal compliance officers submitted a formal request for financial disclosure tied to consultancy accounts associated with Camille Rourke during the months preceding Alexander's final estate revisions. The request was procedural on its face. But investigations rarely began without reason. And this time, the collapse would not remain confined to the Foundation boardroom. Reputation does not collapse loudly. It erodes with precision, one withdrawn invitation at a time, one unanswered call, one carefully worded statement that distances without accusing. By the time Camille Rourke understood the scale of what she had lost, the fall was already complete. The formal notice arrived first. Her discretionary trust had been dissolved under the codicil's automatic trigger. There would be no reinstatement pending appeal. No temporary relief. The language was sterile, procedural, final. Within hours, secondary notices followed. Access to certain accounts was frozen pending compliance coordination with federal authorities. Discretionary asset management privileges were suspended. Her financial advisor's tone, once deferential, now carried cautious detachment. Liquidity will be limited until regulatory clearance, he explained over a secure call. We advise restraint. Restraint? Camille repeated coldly. You advised expansion 2 months ago. That was before federal interest, he replied. The penthouse overlooking the Hudson, technically leased through a holding entity connected to her trust distributions, became another pressure point. Legal correspondence from the property management firm cited review of financial compliance documentation. The implication was unmistakable. Stability was no longer assumed. Public scrutiny intensified with calculated persistence. Investigative journalists began mapping timelines between estate amendments and consultancy transfers linked to Camille's professional accounts. The reporting remained careful, never overtly defamatory, yet layered with suggestive chronology. Analysts discussed fiduciary ethics on primetime panels. The narrative had shifted permanently, from glamour to suspicion. Then came the quiet exile from elite society. The Metropolitan Social Registry, an organization that rarely drew attention to itself, notified Camille that her membership privileges were under review pending alignment with institutional values. It was bureaucratic language for removal. A private art patron declined her RSVP. A gala chairperson returned her donation with gratitude but no invitation. Even acquaintances who had once sought proximity now adopted polite avoidance in public spaces. Isolation, once theoretical, became physical. Camille attempted one final maneuver. Through her attorney, she requested a private settlement meeting with the foundation board. The proposal was strategic: withdraw all public claims, relinquish contested advisory assertions, agree to confidentiality in exchange for partial asset restoration. It was a calculated retreat designed to salvage dignity and liquidity. The board convened briefly to consider it. Their response was unanimous. Declined. The foundation's statement was measured. Institutional integrity cannot be negotiated under external pressure. When informed of the decision, Camille felt something colder than anger settle inside her. "They're erasing me," she said quietly. Her attorney chose his words carefully. "They are protecting themselves." Meanwhile, federal inquiry widened. Requests for financial records expanded beyond estate-linked accounts to include consulting contracts executed during the months preceding Alexander's final amendments. Subpoenas were issued discreetly. Compliance officers began reviewing wire transfers and advisory invoices. Camille maintained public silence, but privately the pressure mounted. Friends who once confided in her now avoided association. Staff resigned with formal gratitude. Even her social media presence, once curated with precision, became a liability she could not navigate. One evening, seated alone in a dim apartment that felt larger and emptier than before, Camille opened her email to find an official communication bearing federal insignia. The subject line was procedural. The content was not. She read it slowly. Notice of grand jury review. Her hands did not shake. She had trained herself beyond visible panic long ago. But something inside her recalibrated permanently. This was no longer about reputation alone. This was about exposure at a level she had never anticipated. Outside, Manhattan glittered indifferently, its towers reflecting power structures that rarely forgave miscalculation. Camille closed the laptop gently, her reflection staring back from the darkened screen. For the first time, there was no one left to call. And somewhere beyond the silence, the machinery of federal review had already begun to move. Power rarely announces its return. It settles back into place quietly, almost invisibly, until everyone realizes it never truly left. 2 weeks after the codicil triggered and Camille Rourke's trust dissolved, the Vail Humanitarian Foundation convened a formal session to confirm interim governance restructuring. There were no raised voices this time, no accusations, no emotional spectacle. Only votes. The resolution passed unanimously. Evelyn Vail was appointed Strategic Advisory Chair under the contingency clause Alexander himself had written. The title was deliberate. Not CEO. Not beneficiary. Not successor. Architect. When the announcement went public, the tone of media coverage shifted again, this time with a measured respect. Financial outlets reframed the narrative, highlighting Evelyn's early role in structuring Vail Dynamics' first merger, her quiet influence during its most volatile expansion years, her absence from public credit despite documented internal authority. Commentators who once overlooked her began using phrases like co-founder in all but name and the structural mind behind the empire. Inside Foundation headquarters, Evelyn's approach was neither celebratory nor vengeful. Her first directive focused on governance transparency. Independent oversight committees were expanded. Compliance reporting mechanisms were digitized and made accessible to donors. Voting thresholds were recalibrated to prevent concentrated influence by any future beneficiary. She did not dismantle Alexander's design. She fortified it. During a private board session, one director leaned forward and asked carefully, "Do you intend to retain advisory control long-term?" Evelyn considered the question without defensiveness. "I intend to stabilize it," she replied. "Control is temporary. Structure is permanent." A press conference followed days later, staged not in a grand ballroom but in the Foundation's research center surrounded by scholars and community leaders. Cameras lined the back wall. The questions came quickly. "Do you feel vindicated?" a reporter asked. Evelyn met the lens steadily. This was never about personal victory. It was about institutional integrity. "Do you believe Alexander misjudged his final years?" another pressed. She paused before answering. Alexander was ambitious, flawed, strategic. He built redundancies into everything, including his own mistakes. The statement carried weight without accusation. In quieter moments, Evelyn allowed herself brief reflection. She remembered the cramped Brooklyn apartment where spreadsheets covered the kitchen table. The nights negotiating venture capital deals while Alexander rehearsed keynote speeches. The first merger she structured while pregnant, refusing to appear anything less than composed in a room full of skeptics. She remembered stepping aside publicly so the company could consolidate under one visible face. None of those sacrifices had been erased. They had simply been obscured. A compensation package was formally offered to her as advisory chair, generous, substantial, commensurate with authority. She reviewed it once and requested modification. Reduce discretionary bonus structures, she instructed the board. Reallocate surplus toward foundation research grants. One board member raised an eyebrow. "You're declining personal enrichment?" "I already earned what mattered," she replied. The statement was not sentimental. It was factual. Outside the foundation walls, Camille's federal review continued quietly. The grand jury proceedings were sealed, but speculation persisted. Evelyn did not comment. She did not interfere. The system would proceed as designed. In the months that followed, the Vail Foundation stabilized. Donor confidence returned. New initiatives launched. Share value steadied. The narrative of scandal slowly gave way to one of recalibration. One evening, long after the staff had left, Evelyn stood alone in the executive conference room. The city lights shimmered against the glass. Alexander's former chair remained at the head of the table. She did not sit in it. Instead, she walked to the window, observing the skyline he had once insisted belonged to him. Power had never belonged to him alone. It had been engineered, quietly, methodically, by those who understood how systems endured beyond personality. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Daniel Cross stepped inside, offering a brief nod. "Stability metrics are holding," he said. "The structure is secure." Evelyn allowed herself the faintest smile. It was always about the structure. As Daniel left, she turned back toward the city. Alexander had tried to control legacy. Camille had tried to possess it. Both had misunderstood something essential. Legacy was not owned by proximity or passion. It was built through architecture. And architecture does not disappear simply because someone attempts to erase the blueprint. The foundation building across the plaza glowed under its illuminated name, Vail, steady, unshaken. Evelyn stood there not as widow, not as rival, not as beneficiary, but as the woman who had never truly been erased. Because power is never inherited. It is engineered by those who understand it. If stories about power, legacy, and the decisions that shape generations matter to you, stay connected. These aren't just dramas, they're lessons hidden inside real human ambition. If you value stories that go deeper than headlines, make sure you're part of this conversation.